Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg. Tony has the bad idea for us this week. Tony, what are you reading for us or talking about? You're not just gonna read, obviously. What do you have?
I have the Mount Pelée eruption and the handling of the St. Pierre officials that kind of dealt with this giant volcanic disaster.
Okay, so I'm assuming from what you've just told me that Mount Pelée is a volcano.
Yes, Mount Pelée is most definitely a volcano.
And it erupted, and that was a bad idea.
Now, the bad idea is more in the handling of the officials around this, more than, a volcano erupting. That's something we don't have that much control over. Maybe building a city in the shadows of a volcano is just a bad idea, but let's get to the story.
Okay.
At the turn of the 1900s, St. Pierre was considered the Paris of the West Indies. On the island of Martinique, this town had just over 26,000 people and was a beautiful center for culture, prosperity, and industry. It rested on a bay of crystalline clear light blue water and stood in the shadow of some quickly rising mountains. Jutting from the sea just a few kilometers behind St. Pierre stood Mount Pelée, a moderately quiet volcano.
I want to take issue with the phrase, the Paris of the East Indies.
It's actually the West Indies. That was my mistake.
Okay. I want to take issue with the phrase Paris of the West Indies. Isn't that kind of like being the Paris of North Dakota?
I mean,
like,
I'm
you're
sure...
not Paris. You're just a nice town.
Yeah, it was a very nice town, and they had good theaters and cathedrals and all sorts of stuff. It was a very prominent, prosperous little town in the middle of the Caribbean. A little bit north of French Guiana.
I had to get out my North Dakota hate there. There's another thing.
Sorry, North Dakota. Occasionally, the town had seen wisps of smoke rise from the mountain, but only the eldest residents remembered the 1851 eruption that happened. This eruption caused some flooding and some property damage, as well as everything being covered in a few inches of ash. It was scary, but nothing that the town couldn't handle. During the early months of 1902, tremors began slowly rumbling the city. People noticed that insects and birds were leaving the area around the mountain, dogs were acting funny, and everything that was living in that area was trying to get away. On the morning of April 23rd, 1902, the wispy smoke came back, this time accompanied by an overpowering stench of sulfur.
It's unfortunate these guys were living in 1902 and not in today's day and age where, you would have seen at least 4 or 5 disaster movies with this exact thing in the plot.
Yeah, you have the one concerned geologist being like, why is this water temperature rising so quickly? People started to get nervous once this hit, but life continued as normal. Electoral primaries were happening, and a few radical parties were working hard to challenge the status quo. Governor Louis Moutet, these elections brewing between the socialist, radical, and progressive parties. A runoff election was slated for May 11th between the top 2 candidates, and both Louis Moutet and local newspapers like Les Colonnes were determined to let the election happen and immediately started to downplay the danger of the volcano.
So wait a minute, we had a story about a volcano, and now we have a story about election... What... not finance, what's the word? Electioneering?
Yeah, I think it's just electioneering, which isn't in itself, it's a crappy thing because politics suck, but it's not exactly some bad story.
Star Wars Episode 1 me here. Come and hear this story about a volcano. All right, I've got you. There's lava brewing. By the way, let's get into the politics of the West Indies.
Well, it all comes together. It all makes more sense here soon.
Okay.
On the 25th and 26th, the billowing smoke turned into rock ejections from the caldera of the volcano. Ash began to cover the town, but public officials still told townspeople not to worry. On the 27th, the first excursions to investigate the volcano were sent out. Members of this squad found that there was water surging from underground in the caldera of the volcano, and it was making an already large lake even larger. It was over 600 feet wide usually, and expanding from there, and it was just straight up boiling. From hundreds of meters away, they actually could hear it boiling like a giant cauldron.
So they're going up to the volcano. On the way to the volcano, there's a lake?
This is in the bowl of the volcano. A lot of times inside of volcanoes, there is a lake that's kind of a...
Oh, I guess I could see that, because they're not always, exposed lava inside there, so you do have that divot, and it's going to fill up with water.
Yep, exactly.
And that's boiling.
Yeah, that's just full-on boiling.
Okay, but tell me more about these elections, Tony.
Well, it was between a guy named... No, we're going to move on to that. Over the next few days, all the rivers surrounding the mountain would double in depth, causing some pretty severe flooding and landslides. The mountain produced loud explosions, earthquakes, and a massive pillar of dense black smoke. Ashes and fine-grained pumice covered the entire northern half of the island. The detonations continued in 5 and 6 hour intervals. This led the local newspaper Les Colonies to indefinitely postpone the proposed picnic on the mountain, originally planned for May 4th. Farm animals started dying from hunger and thirst, as their sources of water and food were contaminated with ash. The paper did, however, put an upbeat article on all this, saying, "Yesterday, the people of St. Pierre were treated to the grandiose spectacle in the majesty of the smoking volcano."
Now, I don't know if you have info on this, but at this point I'm wondering, let's say I'm a citizen of this town, and I see this volcano doing its thing, and I think, this is maybe not the best place to be. Do I have options to leave? Like, is there a boat or a road to somewhere else that I can easily access?
A lot of people at this point were starting to take boats out of there whenever they could. They would commission like these private boats or just take ferries to other parts of the island. Some people just left voluntarily. But that's where the politics of this start coming up and getting really weird. Because there were a lot of reports that the army was being mobilized because of the refugees from the hills around the volcano coming in and causing some violence, some theft, and things like that. But there was also a lot of talk that they were keeping people from leaving because they wanted them there for the elections.
Interesting. So the refugees were keeping them from leaving?
No, the army was dispatched in order to keep people from leaving so that they could have these elections go off with the full voting population.
Okay.
This is one very hotly contested thing because I saw a lot of sources say that, and then I saw a lot of sources just completely ignore that, and I was trying to figure out exactly which one was true. So this is something that is both speculation. Some people say it's fact, some people say it's not, and it's really weird, and you'll find out why there's so little actual first-hand accounts of this a little bit later.
Okay. I do gotta say, though, just sort of by way of commentary, I too have run into this, like, you hear a cool story and you research it for bad ideas, and then you get into the weeds of the details and you're like, okay, well, now what's the truth here?
Yeah, and that's sort of what I was experiencing here, because that was the thing that pushed this onto my bad ideas radar, was this governor that was literally keeping people on the island. I know that on like March 5th and 6th and a few of the days before, they had huge campaigns where they were printing posters and putting them all over town saying you were safe, colluding with the newspaper to make sure that they were putting out articles trying to get people to stay calm. But a lot of that seems to be because they didn't have any sort of plan to be able to manage an evacuation. Because eventually they would set up a commission of some of the more learned people on the island. They got several scientists, that like some natural scientists. They even got like high school teachers. They got artillery commandos that knew how far these rocks would be launched under whatever circumstances. They tried to get as many experts as possible, but whenever they did meet for this, they just decided that because there was a volcano going off on another island, that would ease the pressure of this volcano, and they didn't have anything to worry about. I will say that this was before geology really had a strong feel for volcanoes and what to look for. Like, they didn't have anything really nailed down. Like, the actual thing that they call this sort of process for setting up evacuations is like a Pelean volcano. So, like, it actually got its name from this particular event.
Okay. I think that's understandable. Early 1900s, like, science is definitely a thing, but there's not necessarily a lot of hard data, especially about something as infrequent as a volcanic eruption, where you have to sort of collaborate data from all over the world to really have an idea. And even now, I'm sure geology is evolving in its understanding of exactly how the Earth moves and works around. So you can't hate these guys too much for not knowing exactly what's going to happen. But it sounds like, from what you're saying, you mentioned at the beginning, they just really weren't able to get this evacuation going, so they kind of said, gee, we sure hope that this is going to be okay.
Yeah, and they probably thought it was going to be like the 1850s one, even though they've already had more things going wrong, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. By now, from all of the earthquakes and everything that had been happening, a lot of the cables for communication by telegram were shattered and gone. There were only a few that were left. Like, there was one that was going to the capital, but almost every other part of the island was kind of cut off from them now. Ferdinand Clark, one of the men running for office, started pushing for evacuations. His opponent actually agreed with him in this, but publicly had to denounce him because that's how politics work.
Can I ask, I'm listening to you here, and I don't know that I have a full grasp of the timeline. How long at this point in the story would you say the volcano has been sort of rumbling around and being active? Are we talking about like a month, a few days, a week?
April 23rd was whenever the sulfur started, that sulfur smell. Right now we are at May 4th, about to go into May 5th, because May 5th is when things start getting a lot more drastic.
Okay.
In St. Pierre's Cathedral that Sunday morning, the acting head of the Catholic Church, Gabriel Perel, announced to the public that the commission was on its way to investigate the volcano, and if they had enough faith, they would be safe. On May 5th, it looked like things were starting to calm down. That is, until the ocean receded immediately by 100 meters and then rushed back in a minor tidal wave, sweeping away some docks and pulling a bank manager and some of the tellers out to sea. The real damager, as a sugar plant that made molasses for rum, fell under a powerful lahar. A lahar is a mudflow from a volcano that carries tons of nasty chemicals, pyroclastic elements, and insane power.
So you have a tidal wave, which was probably not directly related to the volcano, right? Like, we're talking about sort of stuff shifting around under the earth, so you have a big earthquake.
Yeah, and it causes the water to recede, and then whenever it rushes back, the tidal wave kind of sweeps up into St. Pierre.
And then also you have this big mudslide that is caused by the volcano, almost like a scissor action. So you have the sea coming up from one side and the volcano coming down from the other side.
Exactly.
It's rough. It's rough stuff.
The owner of the factory, Dr. Auguste Guérin, I'm bad with French pronunciation, so I'm sorry about some of these.
Sacre bleu.
He owned the factory, and he was sitting on higher ground when the lahar broke. He described it as a black avalanche beneath white smoke, an enormous mass more than 10 meters high and 160 meters wide, full of huge boulders and coming down the mountain with a great din. Guérin was able to escape this because his office was on higher ground, but his entire family was in the factory at the time. He said...
Okay, so definitely not like a dude sitting up on the hill watching and not caring as the workers burn.
No, definitely
kind
not.
Of a situation.
He said 3 of those black waves came down, making a noise like thunder, while the sea retreated. The desolation was indescribable. Where a prosperous factory, the work of a lifetime, had stood a moment before. There was nothing left but an expanse of mud forming a black shroud for my son, his wife, and my workmen. So, like...
That's rough.
Yeah, 159 people died in that. And this is when the governor decided it was actually time to convene that conference that we talked about earlier.
Okay.
So you're talking about the 5th, and the actual eruption comes on the 8th. So they're kind of getting late into the game to actually put this council together and meet and get everything decided. There were a few people that really, really wanted this evacuation. 2 people on that council were very vehement about that, and the rest just kind of shrugged it off.
So there was this other volcano that goes off, you said that they thought would have relieved the pressure. When does that happen in the timeline?
That is happening at the same time, actually. Like, this is happening.
Okay, so basically as this lava, or not lava, but this mudslide wipes out the factory on the same day or close to it, this other volcano is also erupting?
Yeah, and that was on a less populated island without cities as close to the actual volcano.
Gotcha. And that may have actually caused the tidal wave, if I'm figuring this correctly, if it happens a little bit sooner.
Unfortunately, they don't have all the data to be able to do that. They did have like seismographs going on in the city, so they were able to tell when the tremors were happening, but I don't think we had enough data to determine which was causing what at the same time. But there were definitely some push and pull action happening right there. By now, the electrical grid was in ribbons and the town was plunged into darkness. The 4,000 refugees were starting to cause problems in the city. This is where things start to get a little less well documented because things are about to get cataclysmic. The early morning of May 8th, people began to get ready for Ascension Day, which is traditionally celebrated 40 days after Easter. Ferdinand Clark looked at the barometer on his patio and it was going insane. He looked into the sky and the sun was basically completely blotted out by this volcanic ash and fire that was rising from the mountain. He immediately sent his family by carriage away and went to warn others. The mountain every few moments kept making rumbling noises and burping noises, and it just started to get very, very hectic with the tremors that were happening.
It must be really, really unsettling to hear a mountain burp.
Yeah, like it sounds comical, but it must be absolutely terrifying whenever there's so much force that a mountain is actually ripping asunder.
Well, also, I mean, you're not sitting like when you hear somebody burp, you're hearing it from like near them, that basically in the same room. If you're hearing a burp sound from miles and miles away,
That's 4 kilometers. So yeah,
yes,
that's pretty intense. On the mountain, a glowing red ball was forming. It throbbed and with sudden force snapped. The mountain was blown to pieces. The pyroclastic charge that throbbed out of it traveled far faster than hurricane-force winds and was over 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Eyewitnesses on boats watched as the entire city was engulfed in a purple cloud of unfathomable forces. Trees and rock were ripped away, statues were pulled from their foundations, and by the time settled, the entire city was gone. In a matter of seconds, 30,000 people were dead.
so this isn't even like lava coming down on these people. This is just the whole thing explodes.
Yeah, the superheated gas that for 21 square kilometers, like, just basically obliterated everything.
I guess you could at least take some solace in the fact that they probably died pretty quick.
Yeah. One eyewitness, Victor Albert, watched the explosion from his field and described the ensuing events to a French newspaper. A flash more dazzling than lightning happened. At the same time, a cloud that formed on the summit of Mount Pelée literally fell on St. Pierre with such rapidity that it was impossible for anyone to escape. Governor Moulet was actually on a steamship about to depart to go back up to the crest of the mountain, and his boat was sank pretty much immediately by the force of this. So he was killed in it as well.
So he didn't win the election, huh?
No, he was the one that was overseeing the election. Ferdinand Clark actually survived this one because he got his family out of there. His competitor did not survive, though.
All right, win by default.
Yes.
Make Pele great again. It's not that hard. It's pretty bad.
Yeah.
You can improve it with some very minor.
If you put a tent
Minor
up,
changes.
it would be improvement. In the city proper, there were only 2 survivors. There was a cobbler whose house was barely shielded by a hill, and a felon named Louis Auguste Siparis, who only survived because of being in a second basement-level dungeon with no ventilation. Even here, most of his body was burned. He would go on to work for Barnum and Bailey, showing his scars and telling the story of the volcano. He was the first black man ever allowed at that circus.
That's a fun little detail.
Yeah, it was really weird for him because he actually escaped the prison like 2 nights before. He was in jail because he had gotten in a drunken brawl and stabbed a friend of his with a bottle. And because he was feeling a little bit sick, he decided to go back to the jail instead of being like out in the elements. So he went back like the night before, got locked up, and that's the only thing that saved his life.
The fact that this guy in a sub-basement level, not directly exposed to any of these gases, still gets burned over all of his body is a real telling sort of indicator of exactly what kind of forces we're dealing with here.
Yeah, it was just absolutely insane. Like, you think of volcanoes and you know there's a lot of fury and force and heat and everything, but you don't think of it being like almost like a nuclear bomb style like blast where the shockwave and everything just destroys everything you know.
And especially at the time, we're not talking about people who have the nuclear bomb as a reference point.
Yeah, like that's a different level of fury than they could even understand. I don't think there's anything else, like even an avalanche or something like that wouldn't destroy a town quite so completely. The only walls
you'd at least have the chance to maybe dig your way out, or you would suffocate, but just to obliterate everything like that must have done.
Yeah, the only real walls that were even standing after this were the ones that were kind of parallel to the blast. You've got a fair amount of walls that are left, but all of the sides that are facing the mountain and facing the ocean are completely blown out. So almost every building is just gone. There's some pretty insane pictures from it.
It sounds insane. I'm glad I was not there. Hope not to experience anything like that.
Yeah. For several months, the devastation would be sorted through. Mostly military men would try to recover the bodies. Teddy Roosevelt actually did one of the first foreign aid projects for this and forced it through so that the U.S. was sending soldiers and money to help with this disaster. And unfortunately, a couple years later, as they were sorting through and they were still trying to rebuild some things, and some people were coming back to the city to start a new life, it erupted again and killed another 2,000 people.
That's just bad luck.
Yeah. And this particular eruption made something that was kind of interesting. It was called the Tower of Pele. And it's basically just a giant rock structure that forced itself from the earth. And it's really cool looking, and it eventually crumbled because it was just too tall and too unwieldy. But it was just such a strange thing that, like, geologists had studied it for a while. Now the volcano is considered entirely dormant, and St. Pierre is a city again, though it only sits around 5,000 people in population.
I can concur on the Tower of Pele being really cool looking. I've found some pictures, and that is worth a look, you guys.
Yes.
It's essentially the whole island, from what I'm seeing here. Or maybe maybe that's not the ocean. It's huge, though. It's this massive piece of rock that's just jutting up from just the surface of the earth. It's wild to think that came out of where the volcano was.
I think it still might be the biggest formation like that. I can't recall what that formation is called, but that is pretty intense. And while we're talking about, like, bad ideas and everything, the bad idea here is really, if you've got what could be a cataclysmic event happening, you really need to evacuate. Like, it was partially laziness, partially just optimistic thinking. But if they would have started sooner, there would be a lot less death here. There would have been a lot of people that wouldn't have left because that's their home, and that happens in any, like, hurricane, any disaster, anything like that. But you could have saved thousands and thousands of people just by ordering that evacuation and held the runoff election a few weeks later. It wouldn't have, well, I'm sure they wouldn't have held it after that, but it seems so short-sighted to me that to just be like, oh, it's going to be okay, even though they have no idea what's coming.
Yeah, it's a really good, assuming that the election did play a part, right, in what was decided here. Assuming that is the case, and we don't have definitive evidence for that, it really...
We know that the newspaper was pushing for it and telling people they were fully safe and they needed to stay to vote, like directly saying stay to vote. We know that they put posters up saying pretty much the same thing. We don't know how forceful they were about keeping people from leaving. Those are still rumors because a lot of the people that could have affirmed those are dead.
But regardless, it's a really interesting lesson about sort of the short-sightedness of human life. The idea that the things that we think are important are not as important as we think they are, and we sort of misvalue how to judge things like this. It's also, I mean, I do think that we have to give them a little bit of credit and cut them some slack for the fact that they are living on an island in 1902. It's probably not, it's not like an evacuation where I am at, where you can just get on the road and maybe there's a bunch of other people on the road, and that's a whole other type of possible bad idea where
not to mention
you get people to evacuate and they're stuck in their cars.
Yeah, and the capital of this island was within a good walk, or a couple days walk from there, but it's only 17,000 people. So if you evacuate 30,000, like, that city's not going to be able to handle it.
Right. The disasters on their own are just a huge problem for humans. So we can't necessarily blame all of this. We can't say that nobody would have died if there had been better decisions, but we could have saved some of them.
Yeah, and
more of them than we did.
And the governor who was kind of delaying these sorts of things did lose his life in this disaster, so he gambled wrongly, and it just didn't pay off. So,
well, wasn't that fun?
What's more fun is whenever you guys support us on Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/humanechoes, you can join and get access to our other podcast, the Bonus Podcast, which is one of the funnest things that we make. You also get really cool pins and various other things. Check out our YouTube channel, youtube.com/humanechoes, and you'll be able to see our gaming content and many of the other things we make. It's a great time. And I'm Tony Southcott, at @TSouthcott on Twitter. That's Albert Berg, Albert_Berg, and we will see you guys next week with more bad ideas.
Take care, y'all.